Welcome everyone to the Opportunity Zones 2.0 webinar, a collaboration between the Housing Assistance Council, Hope Policy Institute, and the Partners for Rural Transformation, where we will discuss the recommendations to activating rural investments covered in our guide, which will be linked to in the chat shortly. All cameras and microphones are going to be turned off for participants today, but that does not mean you cannot interact. Please ask any questions you have in the Q&A function at the bottom and add them throughout as you have them, and we will address them at the end during that Q&A session. These slides and the recording will be available on PRT's websites in the coming days, and the resources and links will be shared in the chat will also be there. And we will get started with some introduction to the speakers. I'll start with myself. My name is Emily Burleson. I am the Senior Manager for Advocacy and Research here at PRT. And I have two rockstar colleagues with me today. I have Diane Standart, who is the Senior Policy Advisor at Hope, and then Seth Leonard, who is with the Housing Assistance Council, and he is their Program Manager for the Center on Rural Multifamily Preservation. And if we could go ahead and get started with the overview of today, we are just going to start with some key takeaways that we want you to walk away with. And before we dive into OZ 2.0, our Opportunity Zone's second round, we're going to take a look at some of the lessons learned in the first round, or what we will refer to as OZ 1.0. And then we'll wrap up with recommendations for high impact rural OZ strategy, the 4 recommendations that are outlined in our guide.
Great. We'll go to the next slide. So we're going to cover a lot of material, and our guide does as well. As we'll put that in the chat, but sort of just high level, big picture takeaways from our guide and our conversation today is what we are with this Opportunity Zone 2.0. It's a once in a decade opportunity. The choices that are going to be made this summer will be in place for the next 10 years. The time is now to start preparing for that selection process. We'll hear later in the presentation that states will begin a selection process in July of this year, but now is the time to start getting ready, thinking about how to make the most of that time. So we just wanted to make sure people are aware of this opportunity that is coming down the pike. One of the primary reasons we need to have this conversation specifically about rural is simply because the statutory definition for a rural opportunity zone is simply too broad. It encompasses many communities that might not be truly rural. As one example, we lift up in the guide, even Atlantic City, New Jersey is considered rural under the statutory definition of rural opportunity zone. So this guide is designed to help dig deeper within that definition of rural to find the communities that will have the highest impact for your state. And to that point, what we'll talk about is 2 really critical tools that will drive a high impact rural strategy is 1, early engagement with rural leaders, stakeholders, and experts in your state and communities, as well as tailored maps that help overlay the rural definition with other things that identify areas of high needs or help align these definitions with other already incentivized investment areas at the state and federal level. So we'll be talking about the role of early engagement and tailored maps through this process. And then finally, again, this guide will be covering 4 recommendations that your state, or if you're a stakeholder, you can be thinking about as states prepare for this July 1 kickoff of their designation process for opportunity zones in their states for the next 10 years. So it's a little bit of roadmap of where we're going, and I will go on to the next slide. And we'll just start with the basic of just what is an opportunity zone. So opportunities are a federal designation. They're a geographic tax incentive meant to attract more private capital into states, as I said, over the course of a decade. These census tracts will ultimately be designated by the U.S. Treasury, meeting their definition of either low income or rural, which we've just shared that the rural definition alone is a little too broad. Once those designations are set by Treasury of the eligible opportunity zone tracts. Then it will move to state governors to choose from that list of tracts. We'll go over that timeline in a little bit. And then once these designations are finalized, again, these opportunity zones become eligible for private investors to have tax benefits for investments in those communities. So it's really designed to pull private capital into geographic areas that might otherwise be overlooked for private investments. So just very quickly, you know, Treasury will select the set of eligible tracts. States will be able to choose the ones for their states, but they can only choose 25% of the eligible tracts in their state, and they have to have a minimum of 25. So that's where you see the choice making that's going to happen at the state level. There is no federal requirement that states designate a minimum number of rural tracts. So this is why it's really key to make sure that rural voices are part of this process, to make sure they're meaningfully included in the selection process. And we haven't yet seen the final designated tracts from Treasury. We expect those later in June, but the guide does point to resources of a couple organizations like Novogradac, the Economic Innovation Group, have created predictive maps of where these designated opportunity zones, including those that are designated as rural, those are available now to start some pre-thinking before we see the official map. So with that, I will turn it over to Seth.
Great. Thank you, Diane. So all of our work from Opportunity Zones this time around doesn't have to start from scratch. We had the benefit in thinking about advocacy, but also implementation strategies for Opportunity Zones 2.0 that builds from what happened in Opportunity Zones 1.0. One of the problematic factors, though, of OZ 1.0 is there's really limited reporting and data available about the program. So you'll see us use a number here that we believe that around $120 billion of investment flowed through the OZ program the first time around. That's still an estimate. You'll find ranges from between 85 and 200 billion out in the world. This 120 comes from our friends at Novogradac, who've done really great survey work to try to estimate it, but it's a huge magnitude. So we know Opportunity Zones 1.0 was a big deal, right? And what we're talking about with that $120 billion investment is also unrealized federal tax revenue for the government, right? And so I think we've all felt a deep sense of responsibility to ensure that that investment is then going towards equitably rural areas and also good mission-focused outcomes. So we're here today to talk about the designation process, but we also learned in OZ 1.0 that merely designated rural or tribal areas is not enough. There has to be real intentionality about driving investment to these zones. So you're also going to hear us talk about strategies outside of just choosing where OZ eligible areas will be. So designation is step one, but we really learned during OZ 1.0 that designation without thoughtful intervention and other alignment of resources won't necessarily create success in rural areas. And beyond Opportunity Zones 1.0 not reaching rural zones, we saw some estimates as high as 78% of investments flowing to just 5% of the zones and 42% of investment flowing to 1% of the zone. I think there's just been wide acknowledgement that that's not a healthy distribution of investment, right? That's a really high concentration. So, and obviously rural was a big missing component of that investment story. But broadly, we would say underserved communities as well. So if we want OZs 2.0 to really transcend areas and projects that were already going to receive investment anyway, we need to have thoughtful and intentional intervention. And specifically, rural and tribal areas with persistent poverty did not receive investment. So those funds tended to flow where investment was already occurring. With that being said, it's really clear this program has been made permanent. It's incredibly important right now to be engaging in a very positive mind frame towards it as having great opportunity for rural communities and community development ecosystem at large. And despite the limitations that we saw in terms of rural investment, there are a lot of case studies and examples of really positive impacts that did occur in rural communities. So we're putting out the alarm sound that without thoughtful intervention, rural investment may not occur, tribal investment may not occur, but there are some really encouraging signs to build from. And these outcomes, I'd like to point out, you can read more about each of the case studies in there, aren't just housing. I work for Housing Assistance Council, right? We tend to have a focus on housing issues. You've got infrastructure, broadband, and commercial development occurring as a result of OZ.1 in rural areas. So we know that this can work, and we know it can be amplified. So while each project goes into, or excuse me, each case study in the guide goes into a specific project, and each one of them is a tremendous story of success and deserves your attention and taking a deeper dive into. But I really want to point out the conditions that led to success in these cases, right? To think more strategically about what was it that caused this group of projects to move forward. And I'd point to three things. One is local leadership, oftentimes through a local community development financial institution or CDFI stepping in and calling capital in and bringing local players to the table. Collaboration between and prioritization of state and federal funds, and then direct engagement from state government and funder and philanthropic systems. So whether you're in a governmental or non-governmental seat out there, there's a I hope you see a role that you can play to try to link investment and projects to OZs as we move into 2.0. So again, we're going to be talking about how to make thoughtful but designations today, but also just this is going to require some ecosystem and enable environment work on behalf of each state. And I just love the pictures to give Diane's organization hope there on the left. You can see Mill Creek in Mississippi, and you can see the progression of how OZ investment through hope was able to create a new community, right? And to create a new part of a community where there's something before it. As our country's facing a housing crisis and an overall need for more investment in rural communities, I just thought that progression was a beautiful picture of the impact that can happen through rural opportunity zones. So lots of positives to build from.
And now that Diane has level set us on what an opportunity zone is, and Seth has gone over some lessons learned and some improvements from 1.0 that we can take into opportunities 2.0, we're going to transition to look at just opportunity zones 2.0. So what's next? Going over the timeline, what are the increased tax incentives, and our 4 recommendations that are in our guide for highest impact rural strategies.
Great. Thank you, Emily. So going to the next slide. We'll just provide everybody a sense of the timeline to understand why we're saying the time is now to get ready and to think about what a rural strategy could be. So this is what I was mentioning at the beginning. This is the timeline that states are going to have to follow once the Treasury releases the official designated eligible opportunity zones, which we think might be later this summer or closer to summer. States will have beginning on July 1. That's when their window to begin this official designation process begins. They'll have 90 days to choose which of those, which 25% of the eligible opportunity zones they want for their state. So that's September 29th is that 90-day window. States do have the option to request an extension if they feel like they need it for an additional 30 days. So we just flagged that in there. And then Treasury will certify those submissions after they're received by the states. And then the designations will go into effect beginning January 1 and again last another 10 years. So we feel like now is a good time to start thinking about some of the strategies we're going to lay out in our guide. Turn it over to Seth.
Great, and we're going to work through these pretty quickly because I'm guessing we don't have a huge audience of accountants that really want to dig into the details of what basis looks like and substantial improvement. But building on my previous comments, as the OZ renewal came up for policy discussion, there's acknowledgement that there also need to be some changes to try to incentivize investors to look at rural communities as viable investments. And so we did see tremendous advocacy and speaking up for rural communities that resulted in 2 really critical tools being added to the toolkit. So first off, just want to remind you that as part of One Big Beautiful Bill, number one, OZs became permanent. And this goes back to this idea of if OZs in your mind weren't incredibly impactful in the field you work in the last time around, we would encourage you not to just cast that aside now. Stay focused because this is a large program and now it's permanent. Let's figure out a way to make it highly effective. There were also these additional incentives added that we think could really drive some investors towards them. The two primary are a 30% step up in basis for investments into rural opportunity zone projects. So that's an increase from 10% in OZ 1.0. And that's going to allow investors essentially to pay less in taxes when they make investments into a rural OZ, right? And so know that there's a backing there that should, or a new component that should drive more investment that direction. And the substantial improvement test, or the value at which you need to add to a property, was also lowered from 100% in OZ 1.0 in urban or in rural communities to 50%. And that lowers the mandated threshold for rehabilitating rural properties, which will allow rural projects and structures to be eligible for additional investment. So we mentioned a bit that there was a change in the way the rural area was defined. And while we agree that that was really needed, we're also going to talk about additional opportunities where you'll also need to more finely tune that for your own state. So these improvements won't totally remove the need for states to be proactive. In other words, you're still going to need to be really intentional about getting engaged in helping incentivize rural investments through opportunity zones, but they're really powerful tools. So if you're thinking what's going to be different this time around, these two that we've got listed here on the rural enhancements are two really powerful tools. So going into let's talk about this designation strategy. So Diane mentioned that there's progress being made in coming up with an estimate of what the rural eligible tracts will be. We encourage you to visit the Novogradac site, EIG site, good information on Urban Institute site as well, to get a bit of a preview of what those maps are likely to look like. But whatever the outcome is, we really encourage states to proactively think about what rural means to you and how you want to prioritize investment in your rural communities and what overlapping designations you might have available for you. So we said in addition to the minimum statutory definition, we want to see, or we hope to see states think about where are your areas of high need, where are your investment ready communities, and how and where might other leverage sources through state and federal funding be able to amplify opportunity zones. So why are we encouraging communities to expand outside of the minimum definition? We've been, in the guide lays out, we're big fans of the duty to serve rural defined areas. But when you combine these elements together and think about how we're both driving capital and capacity towards rural communities, we think that there's a real synchronicity that can occur if you go beyond what the minimum definition looks like. And then again, aligning opportunity zones with proven housing community development programs in areas of high need will only increase the impact the OZs will have besides just having funds flow in. Opportunity zone investment is rarely the only source that completes a project. It takes collaborative resources coming in to get it over the finish line. And we're going to go into these recommendations now in greater detail.
Great. Thank you so much. So, Seth just sort of walked us through what we sort of were talking about. What's the winning formula for a high impact rural zone and combining the minimum statutory definition with areas of high need, investment priorities, and other components of sort of priority, sort of investment ready communities. So how do we get to that winning formula? That is what these recommendations get at, and we provide much more detail in them in the guide. But the first one that we'll talk about in a minute is just this early engagement of rural communities and practitioners. Then combining that engagement with the second recommendation of creating a rural map that helps surface additional opportunities of either the high need or alignment with other investment opportunities. So a map that's tailored to your state's unique needs. 3, then taking a proactive role and leveraging the availability of last mile technical assistance. And 4, finally creating an assessment tool like a checklist that helps organize what states are finding as they move through these different inputs that we're recommending. So we'll move to the next slide, and I'll cover briefly the first recommendation. So, you know, what Seth was mentioning earlier at the beginning, that what makes so many of the case studies successful is the presence of community leadership and buy-in. And so where we want to make sure states and everybody on the call why we're starting now and not waiting till July 1st to talk about this opportunity zone process is the early engagement of rural voices, rural community leaders, community development practitioners, and potential project sponsors. We've talked a lot about how other, stakeholders could include CDFIs that serve rural communities, nonprofit developers, and native CDFI or CDFIs and other organizations, and think broadly about who are community leaders that know what their communities need for the future. And this also includes reaching out to leaders of anchor institutions in rural communities, thinking about hospitals, educational institutions like HBCUs and other schools, and asking what they need for their future development of their institutions in the community. And so there's no need to sort of we don't recommending like making a formal coalition or advisory council, that's what some states may choose to do, but creating this outreach helps surfaces where there's projects that communities already have in mind and where they are and how that can overlay with the designated opportunity zones. And I think the last thing I want to say here is this early engagement is as much about place as it is about project. So the early engagement is about identifying community leadership in places that are designated opportunity zones to make sure that investments that are coming in are aligned with community-led priorities, that there are projects that need investment like affordable housing, like expanded access to healthcare, like access to broadband, that these are additive projects that communities need and want in their community rather than investments that are sort of going to further extract from community B resources and be misaligned with community priorities. So I'll turn it over to recommendation number 2.
Absolutely. So our second recommendation is creating a rural map. And each state's map is going to look different. The overlays may be slightly different. And these maps should be really tailored to your state's unique needs and rural efforts and initiatives already happening. So our first step here out of the 2 are really to start with the Opportunity Zone 2.0 rural definition and that broad definition to start with, which we have already talked about. And then to narrow that scope from there is that second step, which we recommend using your state's registered National State Geographic Information Council membership entity, which we added a QR code on the screen there so you can access that login homepage. But this will make it easier to add overlays to help you illuminate where that high impact rural area really is. And on the next slide, if you will, Seth, are some of the suggested overlays that we have. And these are outlined in our guides beginning on page 5 through 7. So if you want to read more or access the links to the full definitions of these, you may do that. But some of the overlays that we recommend start with looking at persistent poverty counties, which is, Treasury CDFI Fund has a list of those, and also looking at federally recognized native lands. In addition to that, we recommend looking at the rural definition used by FHFA's Duty to Serve program. And you may also utilize some other community development types of data. So this could include broadband data such as FCC broadband maps, BEAD priority areas, Digital Equity Act planning zones, or housing data, including qualified allocation plans and consolidated plans, difficult to develop areas, and qualified census tracts. And you can pull those from your state housing finance agencies. And then last but not least, economic development data. And that can include new market tax credits, rural business development programs, workforce development strategies, and more. And, these will really show the areas of high need in alignment with your existing community development priorities in your state. Next slide, please. Perfect. Thank you. So this is just a visual of a fake map showing you what this overlay may look like in your state. And so this is really how you're taking a larger piece of the pie and kind of narrowing down and scoping down to what that center of the Venn diagram that you saw earlier is, which is that high impact strategy and area for opportunity zones in your area.
Yeah, think about it. We sometimes refer to it as the Goldilocks zone, right? Where all those ingredients are combining together to create the spot where we could have the highest degree of impact in that Venn diagram. Some of the most powerful tools you have for drawing and attracting more opportunity zone investment to rural communities are tools that you already have in your toolbox. You may not have to create a lot of new things. One of the roles I used to play, for example, is helping a state draw its qualified allocation plan. And that's a perfect type of document in place for existing set of policy or a policy vehicle that you could use to prioritize opportunity zones. If you want to see housing and opportunity zone dollars intermingling, being sure that you include OZs as perhaps a priority in the way you're scoring applications for other competitive sources in your state is going to be a really critical step in making sure that those projects are able to reach up and draw the capital in that it's going to be necessary to attract and leverage the OZ as effectively as possible. So other examples include state clean and drinking water IUPs or intended use plans. That we think that that's a big one, and also your broadband infrastructure. If you've got state and federal programs that have selective processes and you're able to set priorities that include opportunity zones and opportunity zone projects as having some benefit in those scoring, because that's where we saw some progress in OZ 1.0 and where we think there's greater opportunity and potential in OZ 2.0 that could create some competitive advantage for those rural projects and rural opportunity zones. And then the last piece we have from a incentive standpoint is thinking about technical assistance. So a lot of states, many states, have community development technical assistance that ranges from helping developers select sites to thinking about energy components to doing the nuts and bolts of what doing putting together a community development project looks like. I've got the example of Indiana in there, which used a USDA program to fund an OZ technical assistance program in OZ 1.0. But actually offering technical assistance or adapting your existing technical assistance for state community and economic development programs towards opportunity zone projects and would-be sponsors or fund starters, especially those that are mission focused, can be a really powerful tool as well. So there's a lot to be said in terms of trying to get investors connect directly with projects, but a lot of times either CDFIs or a state technical assistance program, technical assistance program could play that intermediary role to help make those connections. So if you've got a smaller community development corporation or a nonprofit or a small CDFI in your rural communities that's working hard to pull together a project, having a technical assistance program that could step in and help them branch to both those pre-existing resources and programs that you had before, but also just make a case to OZ investors from other areas, that can be really powerful. Because what this comes down to, and I think what you saw recognized in rural Indiana's program, is that oftentimes the investors that are making opportunity zone investments aren't physically located in rural communities. Some are, and if we can get local OZ investors to invest in the projects that are local to them, that's a really powerful step. But in some cases, we're also making an appeal to investors to leave their immediate known marketplaces and make investments in rural areas. And so having a technical assistance program and different supports for those entities can be a really important step. And then finally, we referenced the idea that starting with formality and some level of transparency in how you're going through this process, there might not be time for you to build a big system, right? And we don't want you to think in an overly bureaucratic manner. But being really thoughtful and how your state approaches setting opportunity zones might start with just creating a checklist about the things that are important to you. And our guide provides an example of how states can be more strategic and systematic and holistic in how they're selecting rural communities and make sure that they're appropriately selected to resource and capitalize on rural OZs. So you can think of this as a rural OZ rubric that we're showing on the screen is in the guide, and that could help you prioritize rural opportunity zones for selection. And that incorporates in the evaluation factors of community readiness, whether an area is in status of high need or persistent poverty, and whether there are also aligned investment partners ready, right, at a local level, either CDFIs or communities that are taking leadership and really looking to draw investment into their area. So a tool like this could help you streamline what things look like at a state level when you're making your selection and designations. So think about it as both an opportunity to create upfront assessments, but then also as opportunity zones go forward, there's not a we are still unclear on what reporting is going to look like for Opportunity Zones 2.0. So creating this type of rubric, in addition to helping you make selections on your designations, could also in the future help you set a baseline of what things you might want to measure in terms of how OZ 2.0 performs in your state, so that you can be a vocal advocate and thoughtful leader in trying to shape what the future of OZ looks like. Emily?
And that concludes what our recommendations are in our guide. And there's a QR code on the screen that can lead you to that guide, as well as a link in the chat. And amongst this team that in putting this together, you know, we realize this guide helps with this first step or phase of Opportunity Zones 2.0, which is the designations. And then there's the rest of the 10 years once the designations are intact. And so we do plan on thinking about what's next and helping ensure continued success with those who are designated. And so we would be happy to hear from you and collaborate more. But otherwise, that concludes the presentation portion of our webinar. And so with that, I will end the recording, but stick around for our Q&A session in just a second.